I used to believe that doing the right thing would eventually speak for itself. But the day my CEO pointed at me in front of 300 employees and called me the biggest mistake this company had ever hired, I realized that the truth can stay silent for a very long time. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that Tuesday morning, I had spent nearly 7 years working at Bennett Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing logistics technology companies in Chicago. I was never the loudest person in the room, never the one giving interviews or shaking hands with investors. I was the engineer everyone forgot until something broke. Then suddenly my phone would ring at 2 in the morning, or during Thanksgiving dinner, or while I was sitting in a movie theater with friends I had not seen in months. I always answered because I believed the company mattered, and because I believed loyalty would eventually mean something. I was wrong. The quarterly town hall was usually filled with applause, polished speeches, and carefully rehearsed optimism. Giant screens displayed rising revenue charts while upbeat music echoed through the auditorium. Employees filled every seat, and late arrivals stood along the walls holding coffee cups and tablets. I noticed the unusual tension the moment Richard Bennett, our CEO, walked onto the stage without his usual confident smile. His jaw was tight, and he skipped every opening joke. Beside him sat the executive leadership team, avoiding eye contact with one another. Something had already gone wrong before the meeting even started. Richard cleared his throat and began talking about disappointing numbers, delayed projects, and declining client confidence. His voice grew sharper with every sentence. Then, without warning, he looked directly at me. 300 heads turned in the same direction. I felt every pair of eyes land on me before he even said my name. "Ethan Carter," he announced into the microphone, "stand up." I slowly rose from my seat near the back of the room, confused and completely unprepared for what followed. Richard stepped closer to the edge of the stage. This is exactly what happens when people hide behind excuses instead of producing results. Some employees think working late makes them valuable. It does not. Delivering results does. A few nervous laughs escaped from different corners of the auditorium. My heartbeat became so loud that I barely heard the next sentence. "The failure of our latest infrastructure rollout falls directly on Ethan's shoulders." The room fell silent. I opened my mouth, intending to explain that I had warned management for weeks that the launch schedule was impossible without additional testing, but Richard lifted his hand before I could speak. "Do not interrupt me," he said coldly. "You have already wasted enough of everyone's time." My manager stared down at his notebook. Coworkers who had shared countless late-night projects with me suddenly found the carpet fascinating. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard continued as though he were reading a verdict. "Effective immediately, your access will be revoked. Security will escort you to collect your belongings after this meeting." My company badge suddenly felt heavier clipped to my belt. 7 years of weekends, holidays, missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and overnight emergencies had been reduced to a 30-second public execution of my professional reputation. I could feel dozens of people watching to see whether I would argue, cry, or lose my temper. Instead, I simply nodded once. Not because I agreed with him, but because I understood something he did not. The systems running behind every truck route, warehouse scanner, and customer dashboard had secrets buried deep beneath the polished presentations, and those secrets had a way of revealing themselves when the wrong person believed they were finally in complete control. No one from security came after me. They did not have to. By the time the applause for the next executive presentation started, I had already emptied the few personal items from my desk into a cardboard box that someone from Human Resources quietly placed beside my chair. It was strangely light. A framed photo of my parents, a coffee mug with a faded Chicago skyline, 2 notebooks filled with ideas that never made it into official planning meetings, and an old mechanical keyboard I had purchased with my own money because the company refused to replace outdated equipment. 7 years fit into a box that weighed less than 15 pounds. As I walked toward the elevator, people avoided looking directly at me. Some pretended to answer emails. Others suddenly found urgent reasons to walk in the opposite direction. A few looked genuinely sorry, but sympathy without action has a way of feeling empty. My closest teammate, Daniel Brooks, finally caught up with me near the lobby. His face was pale. "Ethan," I tried to say something. I smiled politely. "I know." He lowered his voice. "This is not right. Everyone knows you warned them about the rollout." I shrugged. Knowing and admitting are not always the same thing. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed repeatedly. He glanced at the screen and frowned. That is strange. What happened? I asked. The warehouse monitoring dashboard just went offline. I looked through the glass entrance toward the busy Chicago streets without saying anything. Daniel continued scrolling. Now customer tracking is delayed too. He forced a nervous laugh. Probably just bad timing. I wished him luck, shook his hand, and walked out into the warm afternoon sunlight. For the first time in years, my company phone stopped vibrating. There were no emergency messages, no conference calls, no requests to fix something before anyone else noticed. The silence felt unfamiliar. I drove home, placed the cardboard box on my kitchen table, and made myself a sandwich that I barely touched. Around 4 o'clock, my personal phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unknown number from downtown Chicago. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, another unknown number appeared. Then another. By early evening, I had missed 12 calls from different extensions that all belonged to Bennett Dynamics. I did not answer any of them. My employment had ended before lunch. Whatever crisis they were facing was no longer my responsibility. Meanwhile, inside the headquarters, the problems multiplied faster than anyone expected. What had started as a delayed dashboard spread across systems that executives assumed could never fail at the same time. Warehouse scanners stopped synchronizing inventory updates. Shipping estimates disappeared from customer portals. Internal reporting tools froze without warning. None of the failures looked catastrophic on their own, but together they created confusion that rippled through every department. Sales representatives could not answer clients. Customer support agents had no reliable information. Managers began calling emergency meetings every 30 minutes. Richard Bennett assured everyone that information technology simply needed more time. He confidently declared that the disruptions were temporary and unrelated to personnel changes. His words sounded convincing during the first hour. By sunset, even the executives were beginning to exchange worried glances. Daniel and the remaining engineers worked non-stop, comparing logs, restarting services, and checking hardware that appeared perfectly healthy. Nothing they tried restored the missing stability. The systems kept running just well enough to avoid complete failure, yet just poorly enough to damage customer confidence with every passing minute. Every solution uncovered another unanswered question. The architecture behaved as though invisible pieces had quietly disappeared, pieces that no official documentation seemed to mention. Around 8 that evening, Daniel opened a maintenance folder buried deep inside one of the internal servers. Hundreds of files were organized with extraordinary precision. Every emergency procedure, every recovery sequence, every undocumented dependency had been carefully recorded over several years. At the bottom of nearly every revision history was the same name: Ethan Carter. Daniel stared at the screen in complete silence. He realized that the person everyone had watched leave the building only hours earlier might have been holding together far more than anyone had ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit, even though there was nowhere I needed to be. For 7 years, my mornings had started with checking overnight alerts before my first cup of coffee. That day, my phone remained silent. I sat by the apartment window watching the first commuters fill the streets below, while convincing myself that whatever was happening inside Bennett Dynamics no longer belonged to me. I had signed every required exit document. My company accounts had been disabled. My badge no longer opened any doors. Legally and professionally, I was finished. Emotionally, it was not nearly that simple. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel called again. This time I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. "I know you do not owe us anything," he said immediately. "I am not asking you to come back. I just need to understand something." I remained quiet. "We found your recovery documentation. We found hundreds of procedures nobody even knew existed. Half the engineering team cannot explain why our systems depend on them." I took a slow breath. Because they were never supposed to depend on emergency procedures. Those files existed only because management refused to approve permanent fixes. Daniel hesitated. "Richard keeps saying everything is under control. Is it?" I asked. He did not answer for several seconds. "No," he admitted. "Every hour another problem appears." I closed my eyes. I had predicted this exact chain reaction nearly 4 months earlier. During planning meetings, I repeatedly explained that the company had accumulated too much technical debt. Critical infrastructure had been patched so many times that removing one small safeguard could expose weaknesses hidden beneath years of temporary solutions. My reports included charts, timelines, cost estimates, and recommendations. Every presentation ended the same way. Richard would smile politely before saying the company needed faster growth, not more spending. Investors wanted new features. Clients wanted faster delivery. Preventive maintenance never looked impressive in quarterly earnings calls. Eventually, my reports stopped reaching the executive team altogether. Daniel interrupted my thoughts. There is something else. What? None of us can find the automation that balances traffic between the regional servers. Everyone assumed it belonged to our cloud provider, but apparently it does not. I looked out the window again. It never did. Then who built it? I answered honestly. I did. Silence filled the call. Daniel almost whispered his next question. Why did you never tell anyone? I smiled to myself, although there was very little humor in the moment. Because every time something worked, Richard announced that his leadership strategy deserved the credit. Every time something failed, engineering became the problem. After a while, I stopped expecting recognition. I only cared that customers never noticed how close everything came to falling apart. Daniel sighed deeply. I wish more people knew that. Soon they probably will, I replied. After ending the call, I turned off my phone and drove north along Lake Shore Drive simply to clear my mind. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Bennett Dynamics had changed completely. Conference rooms that usually hosted product demonstrations were now filled with emergency response meetings. Whiteboards covered entire walls with handwritten lists of unexplained failures. Department heads argued over priorities while customer support managers reported growing frustration from major clients whose shipping data had become unreliable. Richard Bennett refused to acknowledge any connection between the crisis and my departure. Instead, he insisted that outside cyber interference was the most likely explanation. He instructed the public relations department to prepare statements blaming temporary network instability while assuring investors that business operations remained strong. However, facts became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every engineer who examined the systems discovered the same pattern. Invisible layers of protection existed everywhere. Automatic recovery scripts activated before failures spread. Backup pathways silently redirected traffic during unexpected overloads. Intelligent monitoring tools detected unusual behavior hours before standard software raised any alarms. None of these critical safeguards appeared in official project documentation approved by senior leadership. Someone had quietly built an entire safety net beneath the company's public infrastructure without ever receiving recognition. Shortly before noon, Daniel entered another forgotten archive hidden inside the development servers. Alongside thousands of technical records, he discovered years of unanswered emails addressed to executive leadership. Every message carried detailed warnings, proposed solutions, estimated financial risks, and projected deadlines. Nearly every email had received the same brief response from Richard Bennett or one of his assistants. Not approved. Too expensive. Revisit next quarter. Focus on visible priorities. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair as the truth began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle nobody had wanted to solve. The company was not collapsing because one engineer had left. It was collapsing because the only person who had spent years quietly preventing disaster was no longer there to catch problems before anyone else even realized they existed. By Wednesday morning, the crisis had grown too large to hide behind carefully worded emails and polished executive speeches. Bennett Dynamics had not suffered a complete shutdown, but something even more dangerous was happening. Customers had begun losing confidence. Several national retail partners demanded emergency status updates before renewing shipping contracts worth millions of dollars. Investors flooded the executive office with questions after hearing rumors that major infrastructure problems were disrupting operations. For the first time in years, Richard Bennett no longer controlled the narrative. At 9 o'clock, the board of directors held an emergency conference call that lasted nearly 2 hours. Richard confidently repeated the same explanation he had been giving everyone else. He insisted the technical issues were temporary. The engineering department had failed to execute his strategic vision, and the former employee responsible for the infrastructure had left behind undocumented systems that nobody could reasonably maintain. His presentation sounded polished, but one person listening carefully was not convinced. Margaret Sullivan, the chair of the board, had spent 30 years leading Fortune 500 companies through mergers, market crashes, and executive transitions. She had heard too many polished explanations in her career to mistake confidence for evidence. When Richard finished speaking, Margaret calmly asked one question. Can you provide documentation proving these systems were designed under executive oversight? Richard paused for only a second before answering. Our engineering leadership handled the implementation. Margaret did not react. That was not my question. Silence settled across the conference call. Finally, Richard admitted that the documentation was incomplete because development had moved quickly to satisfy customer demand. Margaret thanked him and ended the meeting with a decision that immediately changed everything. The board voted unanimously to authorize an independent technology audit. Within hours, one of the nation's most respected consulting firms received full authorization to examine every engineering record, infrastructure log, financial approval, and executive communication connected to the company's critical systems. Richard publicly welcomed the investigation, believing it would confirm his version of events. Privately, however, he began calling department heads one after another, asking whether every internal document had been properly organized. Meanwhile, the audit team arrived before lunchtime. Unlike executives impressed by presentations, these investigators trusted only evidence. They requested server histories, software repositories, approval records, security logs, architecture diagrams, and every code revision from the previous 5 years. Engineers across the building granted temporary access, while quietly watching experts dig through systems that had remained untouched for years. Daniel stayed close to the investigators, answering technical questions whenever possible. Less than 3 hours into the review, one consultant frowned while examining the company's primary development repository. "Can someone explain this?" he asked. Several engineers gathered around his monitor. The consultant displayed a contribution timeline stretching back nearly 7 years. Thousands of verified code submissions appeared in chronological order. At first, the graph simply looked busy, but then an obvious pattern emerged. One name appeared over and over again, often late at night, early in the morning, on weekends, during federal holidays, and even on Christmas Day. Ethan Carter. Another consultant opened the security repository. The same name appeared. Then the disaster recovery platform. Ethan Carter. Performance optimization tools. Ethan Carter. Automated monitoring systems. Ethan Carter. Regional server balancing. Ethan Carter. Every time they opened another critical project, the same contributor appeared as the primary architect, reviewer, and emergency responder. One investigator quietly asked, "Was this employee your chief technology officer?" Daniel slowly shook his head. No, he was officially listed as a senior systems architect. The room fell completely silent. The investigators continued digging deeper. They compared executive reports presented to the board against actual development histories. Something immediately stood out. Projects celebrated in shareholder meetings as leadership achievements had been built almost entirely by engineering teams led technically by Ethan. Presentation slides praised executive vision, while technical records revealed countless overnight revisions submitted under Ethan's account only hours before product launches. Even more surprising, every major system contained detailed comments explaining future risks, recommended upgrades, and long-term maintenance plans. Those warnings matched almost perfectly with the failures now spreading across the company. Late that afternoon, Margaret Sullivan received the audit team's first preliminary summary. It contained only one sentence highlighted in bold at the top of the report. The company's operational stability appears to have depended disproportionately on one former employee whose documented contributions greatly exceed his officially recognized responsibilities. Margaret slowly lowered the report onto her desk, looked out the window for several quiet moments, and then instructed her assistant to schedule a full board meeting for the following morning because she had a growing suspicion that the company had not merely lost an employee. It might have publicly discarded the very person who had quietly kept the entire business alive. Thursday morning began with an unusual silence inside Bennett Dynamics. The usual confidence that filled executive hallways had disappeared, replaced by whispered conversations and closed conference room doors. The independent audit team had worked through most of the night, examining millions of system records, archived emails, security reports, and software revisions. By sunrise, they had assembled a timeline that no executive presentation had ever revealed. Margaret Sullivan entered the board conference room carrying a thick binder filled with preliminary findings. Around the polished oak table sat directors representing major investors, each one expecting another discussion about technical failures. Instead, they received something entirely different. The lead investigator connected his laptop to the large display and spoke calmly. We originally believed we were investigating an infrastructure outage. We now believe we are investigating years of undocumented operational dependence on a single employee. The first slide displayed a graph comparing executive project approvals with actual engineering contributions. The difference was impossible to ignore. While official reports credited leadership initiatives for major technological successes, development records consistently showed Ethan Carter designing, implementing, testing, repairing, and maintaining nearly every mission-critical system supporting daily operations. Another slide revealed emergency response histories. Over the previous 7 years, more than 400 overnight incidents had threatened customer services. Every one of them had been resolved before business hours began. Most executives had never known those incidents existed because customers rarely experienced noticeable disruptions. Time after time, the response logs identified the same engineer quietly restoring stability while the rest of the company slept. Margaret leaned forward. Are you saying these emergencies were never reported upward? The investigator nodded. Many were documented internally. However, they were resolved before creating financial losses, so they received little executive attention. Another board member asked the obvious question. How much money did these interventions save? The consulting team projected a detailed financial estimate onto the screen. Avoided contract penalties, prevented shipment delays, eliminated compliance risks, blocked infrastructure failures, and reduced downtime combined into an estimated savings exceeding $180 million over 7 years. The room became perfectly still. One director quietly removed his glasses and read the figure twice before speaking. This cannot be accurate. The lead investigator replied without hesitation. We verified every calculation using customer agreements, insurance data, operational records, and independent financial models. If anything, this estimate is conservative. More evidence followed. Archived security logs showed multiple attempted intrusions that had never reached public attention because Ethan had quietly redesigned authentication systems before vulnerabilities could be exploited. Internal emails documented repeated recommendations for disaster recovery upgrades that management postponed to reduce quarterly expenses. Maintenance records showed Ethan personally creating automated backup procedures after discovering weaknesses that could have stopped nationwide operations during severe weather or regional network failures. None of those improvements appeared in executive presentations or annual shareholder reports. They simply became part of the company's invisible foundation. Daniel was invited into the meeting to answer technical questions. He explained that many younger engineers had assumed the company's remarkable reliability came from expensive commercial software. Only after Ethan left did they realize that many of the most dependable protections had been custom-built over several years without public recognition. One board member asked, "Why would someone continue doing all this without demanding credit?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. Because Ethan believed customers deserved reliable systems whether anyone noticed his work or not. He always said the best engineering is invisible because nothing breaks. Margaret quietly wrote that sentence into her notebook. As the morning continued, investigators uncovered another surprising discovery. Ethan had repeatedly submitted detailed proposals requesting permanent infrastructure improvements. Each proposal included projected costs, long-term savings, implementation schedules, and risk assessments. Many had been rejected within minutes of submission. Some carried handwritten executive notes emphasizing faster product releases over preventive engineering. Others had never received any response at all. Yet despite those rejections, Ethan often created smaller protective solutions during his own time so the underlying risks would not eventually harm customers. He never billed overtime for many of those efforts. He simply solved problems because leaving them unresolved would have endangered the business. Margaret slowly closed the binder and looked around the board table. "We believed we were reviewing a personnel decision," she said quietly. "Instead, we have discovered that the company spent years benefiting from extraordinary dedication while failing to recognize it. No one disagreed. Then the lead investigator cleared his throat once more. There is one final issue you need to understand before reaching any conclusions. Every face turned toward him. He opened a folder marked Executive Communications and placed several printed email chains on the table. The evidence strongly suggests that senior leadership knew exactly who was responsible for these achievements long before this investigation began. Richard Bennett had spent years believing that confidence could outrun evidence. For most of his career, it had. A polished presentation, a carefully chosen statistic, and a firm voice during investor meetings had always been enough to control the conversation. But inside the board conference room, confidence carried no weight against verified records. As investigators continued reviewing executive communications, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Hundreds of archived emails showed Ethan Carter repeatedly warning senior leadership about infrastructure risks months before they became serious concerns. Every recommendation was professional, detailed, and supported by measurable data. Every proposal included realistic budgets, implementation schedules, and explanations written in language that even non-technical executives could understand. The responses were strikingly different. Richard's replies were consistently brief. Delay until next quarter. Too expensive. Focus on revenue. We will revisit later. In several cases, he instructed department managers to stop bringing engineering concerns directly to executive meetings because they distracted from growth initiatives. Margaret Sullivan quietly organized the emails in chronological order across the conference table. Looking at them together created a timeline that no single document could reveal. The board was no longer examining isolated decisions. They were seeing years of deliberate choices that consistently ignored technical advice while publicly celebrating operational success. Richard requested a private meeting with Margaret shortly after lunch. She agreed, but only inside the same conference room where investigators remained present. Richard entered carrying several folders and attempted to project his usual confidence. "Margaret," he began, "I think this situation is being misunderstood. Every growing company depends on talented employees. Ethan was valuable, but these investigators are exaggerating his importance." Margaret calmly folded her hands. "Then help us understand why every independent audit points to the same conclusion." Richard immediately shifted the discussion. "Engineers naturally document everything they touch. That does not mean they built entire systems alone." The lead investigator opened another report. "We considered that possibility. We interviewed 38 current and former engineers. Their testimony consistently confirms that Mr. Carter personally designed most of the recovery architecture while mentoring junior developers during implementation." Richard's expression tightened. "People are emotional after recent events. System logs are not emotional," the investigator replied. "Neither are version histories, security certificates, approval timestamps, or financial records." Richard remained silent. Margaret slowly slid several printed emails across the table. "Can you explain these?" Richard looked down. One message from nearly 3 years earlier caught his attention immediately. Ethan had warned that delaying a server modernization project would eventually create cascading failures throughout the logistics platform. Richard had rejected the request within 6 minutes, writing that the upgrade would not improve quarterly investor presentations. Another email showed Ethan requesting permission to hire 2 additional infrastructure engineers after documenting increasing operational risks. The request had been denied because executive leadership preferred expanding the marketing budget instead. A third message revealed Ethan volunteering to implement temporary protections without additional compensation while waiting for permanent approval that never arrived. Richard quietly pushed the papers aside. "Every executive makes difficult financial decisions." Margaret nodded. "That is true, but not every executive later claims personal credit when employees quietly solve the resulting problems." The room became still. One investigator displayed archived recordings from previous shareholder meetings. During several presentations, Richard proudly described major reliability improvements as examples of executive strategic leadership. Matching technical records demonstrated those improvements had been completed by Ethan weeks before the presentations occurred. There was no evidence Richard had participated in the engineering work itself. Worse, internal planning documents showed Ethan had not even been invited to those presentations. Daniel entered the conference room after being asked to verify several technical details. He answered every question factually without emotion. He explained how Ethan routinely stayed after everyone else left, quietly solving issues that would otherwise affect customers the following morning. He described weekends when Ethan worked alone because budgets did not allow additional staffing. He also confirmed something that surprised even the investigators. Ethan often instructed younger engineers never to mention his extra work publicly because he believed protecting the company's reputation mattered more than receiving recognition. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. None of this proves I intentionally misrepresented anything. Margaret looked directly at him. Perhaps not by itself. She gently placed one final document in front of him. It was an internal performance evaluation signed by Richard himself only 8 months earlier. In his own handwriting, he had described Ethan Carter as the company's most technically indispensable employee and warned that losing him would create significant operational risk. Richard stared at his own signature without saying a word while everyone else in the room realized that the investigation had just crossed an important line. The question was no longer whether the board had misunderstood Ethan's value. The question had become whether Richard Bennett had knowingly hidden it from everyone else. Friday morning felt different from every other morning the company had experienced in years. Employees arrived early, but instead of gathering around coffee machines or discussing weekend plans, they stood in small groups whispering about the emergency meeting that had suddenly appeared on everyone's calendar. Attendance was mandatory for every department director, executive, and board member. Nobody knew exactly what would happen, but rumors had already spread through every floor of the headquarters. Some believed the company had suffered a cyber attack. Others expected mass layoffs. Very few guessed that the meeting was about one engineer who had quietly left the building only 3 days earlier carrying a cardboard box. Richard Bennett entered the executive conference room 10 minutes before the meeting began. His usual confident stride had disappeared. He carried no presentation notes, only a thin folder that remained unopened on the table. Around him, board members spoke quietly among themselves while the independent investigators connected their laptops to the large display screen. Margaret Sullivan arrived last. She greeted no one individually. Instead, she simply took her seat at the head of the table and said, "Let us begin." The first hour was devoted entirely to evidence. There were no opinions, no speculation, and no emotional speeches. Every conclusion came directly from documented records. Charts showed years of software contributions. Server logs demonstrated who responded to emergencies. Security reports identified who prevented vulnerabilities from becoming public incidents. Financial models estimated the enormous losses that had been avoided because preventive engineering work had been completed before customers noticed problems. Each slide reinforced the same conclusion from a different angle until disagreement became increasingly difficult to justify. The investigators then displayed side-by-side comparisons between executive presentations and internal engineering records. Public credit repeatedly flowed toward executive leadership, while technical documentation consistently traced the work back to Ethan Carter and the engineering teams he quietly supported. One board member who had remained skeptical throughout the investigation finally leaned back in his chair and said softly, "This is not one coincidence. This is a pattern." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." She then asked Daniel to enter the room once again. Daniel spoke carefully, never exaggerating and never criticizing anyone personally. He described how Ethan routinely refused public recognition because he believed reliable systems mattered more than personal attention. He recalled nights when Ethan remained in the office until sunrise after everyone else had gone home simply because a potential problem made him uncomfortable. He remembered Ethan canceling vacations after receiving alerts from monitoring software. He explained that junior engineers trusted Ethan not because of his job title, but because he always shared knowledge instead of protecting it for personal advantage. When Daniel finished speaking, nobody questioned his credibility. His account matched every technical record already verified by investigators. Margaret then turned toward Richard. "You now have the opportunity to address the board before we conclude." Richard slowly stood. For several seconds, he searched for words that never seemed to arrive. Finally, he said, "I made decisions based on what I believed was best for the company." Margaret replied calmly, "No one disputes that executives must make difficult decisions. The concern before this board is whether you knowingly accepted recognition for work performed by someone else while repeatedly ignoring documented warnings that placed the company at unnecessary risk. Richard attempted one final defense. Leadership is about directing teams, not writing software. Agreed, Margaret answered. Leadership is also about honesty. She pressed a button on the conference room remote. A video recording from the previous annual shareholder meeting appeared on the screen. Richard proudly described a groundbreaking infrastructure stabilization initiative as the result of executive strategic planning. When the recording ended, the investigators immediately displayed development histories proving that every major component discussed in the presentation had been completed months earlier by Ethan and his engineering team before Richard had even approved the public announcement. No one spoke. There was simply nothing left to debate. Margaret requested a formal vote from the board. The motion was straightforward. Richard Bennett would be immediately removed as Chief Executive Officer pending final legal and governance review, and interim leadership would assume responsibility for restoring operational trust. One by one, each board member raised a hand in favor. The decision was unanimous. Richard quietly gathered the unopened folder he had carried into the room, looked around at colleagues who avoided meeting his eyes, and walked toward the exit without saying another word. As the conference room door closed behind him, Margaret remained seated for a long moment before speaking again. "There is still one matter unfinished," she said. "The person whose integrity protected this company deserves to hear the truth directly from us, not through rumors or headlines." Every director understood exactly who she meant. I was sitting on the small balcony outside my apartment Friday afternoon when my phone rang again. The caller identification displayed Bennett Dynamics, but this time it was not an unknown extension. It was Margaret Sullivan. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Mr. Carter," she said with a calm and respectful voice, "this is Margaret Sullivan from the board of directors. Do you have a few minutes to speak with me?" "Of course," I replied. There was a brief silence before she continued. "First, I owe you an apology. What happened earlier this week should never have happened." I looked across the Chicago skyline without saying anything. She continued carefully. "The board has completed an independent investigation. We now understand the full extent of your contributions to Bennett Dynamics, and we also understand that our leadership failed to recognize both your work and your professionalism." Hearing those words felt strangely unreal. For years I had imagined someone simply acknowledging the truth, yet now that it was happening, I felt no excitement, only relief. Margaret asked whether I would be willing to come to headquarters for a private meeting that afternoon. After thinking for a moment, I agreed. Walking back into the same building only 4 days after leaving with a cardboard box felt almost surreal. The receptionist who had watched me leave earlier in the week stood up the moment I entered. She smiled nervously and welcomed me back. Several employees in the lobby recognized me immediately. Instead of avoiding eye contact as they had before, they quietly nodded with genuine respect. Daniel was waiting near the elevators. Without saying a word, he stepped forward and gave me a brief handshake that quickly turned into a hug. "I am glad you came," he said. "Things are different now." We walked together toward the executive conference room. As the doors opened, every board member stood from their seats. I had attended dozens of meetings inside that room over the years, but never as someone people waited to welcome. Margaret stepped forward first. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming." She extended her hand. "On behalf of the board of directors, I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated. Our investigation confirmed that your professionalism, technical leadership, and integrity protected this company for years. We failed to recognize that while it mattered most." I shook her hand. "Thank you." She invited me to sit, but before anyone discussed the future, she presented a formal statement signed unanimously by the board acknowledging my documented contributions. They had also prepared a revised employment offer unlike anything I had ever expected. The position was Chief Technology Officer with full authority over infrastructure strategy, engineering standards, and long-term technology investment. The compensation package was generous, but what caught my attention was a single sentence near the end of the proposal. "Engineering recommendations regarding operational safety shall not be overridden without independent board review." I looked up from the document. "You changed the governance policy?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Good companies learn from expensive mistakes." Before I could respond, The conference room doors opened once more. Department directors, engineering managers, and dozens of employees quietly entered the room. Daniel stood near the front beside several junior engineers I had mentored over the years. Margaret addressed everyone. Many of you witnessed events earlier this week. Today you deserve to know the complete truth. She summarized the investigation with remarkable honesty. She described the audit findings, the years of undocumented engineering work, the financial impact of preventive maintenance, and the importance of integrity in leadership. Nobody interrupted. Several people looked visibly emotional as they realized how much had remained hidden behind executive presentations. When Margaret finished, the room remained silent for a heartbeat before someone near the back began clapping. Then another person joined. Within seconds, every employee in the room was standing. The applause grew louder until it echoed throughout the conference floor. I recognized faces of people who had once hurried past my desk without knowing what I actually did. Some smiled. Others nodded quietly. A few wiped away tears. The recognition felt overwhelming, not because I needed applause, but because it represented something much more valuable than a promotion. It represented truth finally catching up with appearances. When the applause faded, Margaret looked toward me. "Mr. Carter," she said, "the decision is entirely yours. Bennett Dynamics would be honored to have you lead its technological future." Every person in the room waited for my answer, believing they already knew what it would be. The only person who had not yet spoken was me. I looked around the room one last time before setting the proposal back onto the conference table. Every face reflected hope, curiosity, or quiet expectation, but none of them could answer the question I had been asking myself since the moment I walked out of the building with that cardboard box. Margaret waited patiently. She understood that this decision could not be rushed. Finally, I smiled and said, "I truly appreciate everything the board has done today. Your apology means more than you probably realize. It tells me this company is finally willing to face the truth. But I cannot accept this position." A wave of surprise passed through the room. Daniel looked at me with raised eyebrows, while several board members exchanged puzzled glances. Margaret spoke gently. "May I ask why?" I nodded. "For years I believed that if I worked hard enough, eventually people would value the work itself. I learned this week that no system can remain healthy if its culture depends on one person quietly carrying responsibilities that should have been shared. Bennett Dynamics deserves a fresh beginning, but so do I." Nobody interrupted. "I am proud of everything we built together," I continued. "I have no resentment toward the engineers sitting in this room. They worked just as hard as I did. The real lesson is that organizations succeed when honesty travels upward as quickly as information does. If people become afraid to tell leaders uncomfortable truths, problems do not disappear. They simply grow until everyone can see them." Margaret slowly nodded. "That is a lesson we intend to remember." I thanked everyone once again, shook hands with the directors, and spent nearly an hour talking with engineers who wanted to express appreciation they had never found the courage to voice before. As I walked out of the headquarters for the second time that week, the building no longer felt like a place that had rejected me. It felt like a chapter that had finally reached its natural ending. 2 months later, I rented a modest office on the north side of Chicago and founded a technology consulting company focused on resilient logistics infrastructure. The office contained only 6 desks, a whiteboard, and more determination than furniture. Daniel joined me after finishing several transition projects at Bennett Dynamics. 3 other engineers followed within the next few weeks, not because I recruited them aggressively, but because they wanted to build software in an environment where transparency mattered as much as innovation. We established one simple rule that hung on the wall from the first day. If someone identifies a risk, leadership listens before making decisions. That sentence guided every meeting we held. During our first year, we worked with regional manufacturers, transportation companies, and healthcare suppliers across the Midwest. We were never the cheapest consultants, but clients appreciated something they rarely found elsewhere. We explained problems honestly before proposing solutions. Word spread steadily. Referrals became new contracts, and new contracts became long-term partnerships. Exactly 1 year after leaving Bennett Dynamics, I received an invitation to speak at a national technology leadership conference in Denver. The topic assigned to me was building resilient organizations through trust and engineering excellence. While preparing for the presentation, I learned that Bennett Dynamics had completed its own transformation. Margaret remained board chair, new executive leadership had strengthened engineering governance, and the company had regained customer confidence. They were no longer hiding technical realities behind polished presentations. They were addressing them openly. Hearing that news brought me genuine satisfaction because success built on honesty benefits everyone. As for Richard Bennett, I never saw him again. I heard through industry contacts that he had quietly stepped away from executive leadership after the board completed its governance review. I wished him no harm. Carrying bitterness would only have chained me to a past I had already outgrown. Looking back now, I understand that being publicly humiliated was never the defining moment of my story. The defining moment was choosing not to let someone else's judgment determine my own worth. Titles can disappear overnight. Recognition can arrive years late. Careers can change in a single meeting. But integrity has a remarkable way of surviving every setback because it does not depend on applause. It depends on character. If there is one lesson I hope every person who hears this story remembers, it is that quiet excellence may go unnoticed for a season, but truth has a patience that pride never does. Eventually, the evidence speaks louder than the loudest voice in the room, and when it finally does, no presentation, no title, and no public humiliation can silence it.